out to Socrates. Socrates still trying to get the opening. Oh, Socrates! Whoa!
And there it is. The crazy gang have beaten the Culture Club.
Maggie Thatcher, can you hear me? Maggie Thatcher, your boys took a hell of a beating. Your boys took a hell of a beating.
Hello and welcome to You Have to Say That's Magnificent. The little brother of your boys took a hell of a beating on the World Cup theme, and we're back on the World Cup managers topic once again to follow up on a previous module where we talked all about Italy's Vittorio Pozzo in the 1930s. This time, though, we're heading to Europe's other most successful nation in World Cup terms to discuss the 1974 winning West German manager Helmut Schon. West German in brackets, probably should say, because there's a little bit of a crossover to the East too. But with me to discuss it all is the excellent author and writer of the terrific book, How to Win the World Cup, Chris Evans. Hi there, Chris. How are you?
Hi, not too bad, thanks. How are you?
Very good, thank you, Chris, and looking forward to getting stuck into this weighty topic that we've got on our hands again today. We're beyond fascism this time and Pozzo and all of that, but there's still plenty of Cold War intrigue that we've got this time, I think. Most certainly. So I was going to start off by asking why Helmut Schon has attracted your interest specifically for this kind of conversation. You know, he's probably someone who, while we may all know that he's won the World Cup, probably don't know too much beyond that, I think, in many cases. A quick scan through the record shows he is essentially one of the most successful international football managers there's ever been, which is probably more than many people would quite realise.
Yeah, I mean, look, professionally, he's very, very notable, not just for his record. So I think he's most matches managed at a World Cup, although that could go this year, depending how France get on. And most wins, similarly, could go depending how France get on, because Didier Deschamps after those records, as well as Pozzo's if he does win again. But it's also kind of his impact. So when you look at what Schon got from other people who were very notable, and also who he influenced and how it kind of developed the way German football in particular went after his time, that's really notable. But also I think Schon is such a fascinating character as well from a personal side. I mean, you touched on it, that he was a West Germany manager, but was a proud Dresdenite, I suppose, on the other side. And actually, historically, his impact actually within areas around post-war Germany as well. And I think also, obviously, what happened to him when he did go on to win his star as a World Cup winning manager in 74 as well is quite fascinating. So, yeah, he's all round. I would say he's one of the most interesting managers who's ever been to a World Cup and been successful at a World Cup.
And he sported a great flat cap, which is always a nice extra benefit, I think. So yes, for a bit of background, as Chris mentioned there, Helmut Schon, he was born in Dresden, East Germany. No, it was probably pre-war, wasn't it? It was Prussian Empire or whatever at the time, God knows. Anyway, he fled East Germany in 1950 due to political interference in sport. Who'd have thought that would go hand in hand with East Germany? This did add a compelling Cold War dimension, obviously, to his later success with West Germany. Equally fascinating to me, though, is the fact, as a lover of World Cup history and all that kind of stuff, West Germany was not the only national team he managed in a World Cup game, qualifiers in this case. He coached the Saarland national team, even facing West Germany in the 1954 World Cup qualifiers, and he was up against Sepp Herberger on that occasion. Now, obviously, this is another World Cup winning manager, someone he would then actually go on to assist as West Germany coach in the years that followed, and then succeed as national manager. So I know you want to talk a bit about influences on Helmut Schon. I guess that's probably the most clear direct influence is Sepp Herberger and how much he had, but I think there's other deeper influences that go further back as well.
Yeah, and I think this is interesting. I think he did, Herberger gave Schon that opportunity. And I think partly because they'd seen the impact that he'd had. I mean, you mentioned the Saarland there, and obviously it was that sort of gap between France and Germany, and it was French owned following the war. And they were actually invited to play, and FC Saarbrücken as well were the club side, and they were invited to play within that French football system as a sort of like a nice gesture almost. And it turned out that Schon and what he was doing, because of his influences, was particularly groundbreaking. And once he'd done that and shown them, he actually got that sort of national pride. There were a lot of Germans obviously still living in the Saarland at the time, and their success at that time, their football success, actually got a lot of people around excited and showing their nationalism. And that actually led to the Saarland going back into West Germany, which is where obviously the job then goes, and Sepp Herberger offered him that job to go and work with him. But I do think they were quite different characters, Herberger and Schon, because I think Herberger was that sort of old school general, if you like, and he was the disciplinarian. He was the kind of barking orders, the more traditional sort of leader that you would imagine of that sort of time. Whereas Schon was kind of, I think he was known as a gentleman, and the way that he did it was a lot more kind of like as a group, he worked with people, and his way of playing was very different as well. Because I think German football was very similar to British football for a long time, in that it was kind of hard work and strength and power. That was really important for them. And that, you know, as it did with England for a short while, proved to be quite successful. But Schon's actual influence came further back from Jimmy Hogan, who'd obviously come from England and moved over to England, and he actually over to Europe, and he worked in Germany for a while, and actually was at a club where a Dresdner in Dresden at the time, where Schon was a young player and saw Hogan and his methods and this idea of using space and pass and move, and Schon always remembered that. And that started to be a big influence with Schon as he kind of went into his own managerial career. And that's what ultimately led to the success at Saarland, and then got him the opportunity to work with Herberger at West Germany in the future.
So we talk of the influences there. Jimmy Hogan's obviously a very famous example of one of several English and Scottish pioneers, I guess, who moved abroad, maybe looking for more expansive football than was allowed or was possible at the time in the British Isles, well, in England especially anyway, where things were very, very rigid, and they got the opportunity going to Europe to impose new ideas, and they were taken up, especially in the Central European areas. In terms of how that impacted Schon's thoughts in terms of playing style, what would you say on that, Chris? Can we say that Schon has a particular style? And if we think of by 1972 and 1974, you know, this is the era of total football from the Dutch, but the West Germans weren't exactly far off that themselves, really, and Bayern Munich was superbly strong and so on. So by then, was he adopting their approach and tweaking that, if you like, or did he have his own sort of style and approach and how he would expect teams to play?
Well, I think there was strong influences from that. Obviously, he'd seen what Hogan was doing at Dresdner at the time, and he'd remembered that, and then kind of wrote letters to him after the Second World War to kind of find out more. And Schon, when he retired, paid homage to what Hogan had done for him and the influence he had on German football. And I think that obviously was a big part of it. But having said that, I think because he'd had that experience under Herberger, and Herberger gave him that opportunity, he kind of took some of those West German values as well and married them together. But I think in terms of style of play, he did this idea of making space was a big thing for him. And he had Gunter Netzer moving them around to kind of get most out of him in those early 70s, but it also created that space for Franz Beckenbauer. So obviously Franz Beckenbauer was the inventor of the libero role, but that was because Schon gave him that sort of freedom. And like I said earlier, this sort of way of working closely with his players. He wasn't kind of a dictator in the way Herberger was. He worked with players to get the best out of them. So he created an environment that would lead for these things. So whether he was the tactical brain behind that, or whether he was kind of one of the conductor of a number of people, is probably more like it. But he certainly saw the benefits of passing and moving and making space and using that space. And obviously that's what Beckenbauer kind of excelled in at the time. And that was a key part of why they were so successful in 72 and then in 74.
Well, let's get into that era then. obviously, the West Germany at that time ultimately became European and world champions, which is a rare thing even still. Very few teams have done that. And I think it's quite often been, well, France did it the other way around, then Spain did it this way, and then got another one on top of it. But I can't think of any other examples of this actually happening. So it is a rare and impressive feat. Some might say, however, that 1972 was their real peak. And I don't know whether that's people just looking misty-eyed at 74 and wishing the Dutch had won. And we'll come on to a few specifics of the various games in this tournament in a sec. But what do you think to that? Did they really peak at that 1972 Euros? Obviously, there's significant victories over England on the way to that in the quarterfinals, which maybe skews thinking in this country on it, perhaps. Netzer, who you mentioned there, being probably the most maverick or creative player that he had at his disposal, was well used in 72, but by 74 he was much more on the fringes of things and less reliable. And maybe it's the Netzer thing that makes people think the 1974 team were less, or a notch or two below the 72 team, perhaps. I don't know. What do you think?
I think it's difficult because how, even within 2 years, how you compare one to another, because in reality, especially, back then as well, we're talking about a few games was the difference almost. And that, as we know with any football, domestically, internationally, any era, if you pick out a selection of 4 or 5 games and kind of say, were they better or not? I would say this, very effective. And I would say, you talk about England in 72 and how that affects how people view that. Well, if there hadn't been the West Germany defeat to East Germany in 74, we look at that a little bit differently? So I think it is difficult to find that. What I would say is it's a very different sort of challenge. And in how to win the World Cup, I touch on this, is it's really difficult to retain, or like you say, go on and win something else afterwards, because you end up picking the same sort of players. And sometimes with Netzer, you say, kind of gone off a little bit, and it's on the manager to try and refresh that team all the time. But sometimes you look around and you pick out people who have served you so well previously, and you want to pick them again. And you mentioned Spain and France. Well, what's quite interesting with both those times is they had 2 different managers did it for them. See, Amy Jacquet won it World Cup in 98 with France, and it was Roger Lemaire in Euro 2000. And then you've got Aragonés and Del Bosque for Spain as well. And I think that does it. But Del Bosque actually was one of these who, the next World Cup, when they'd done it, he picked all the same old faces again. And that was one too far for them in Brazil. So I think Schon, there is a skill with all managers of knowing when to refresh your team. And the fact that they won it back to back should stand out and say, they were always kind of evolving. And, success is success at the end of the day.
Well, absolutely. And you mentioned earlier about his sort of style, people skills, I guess, the softer skills that not every football manager is good at. And some are the stick approach. He's maybe a little softer on that. In a squad of very strong personalities, and the German squad of the early 1970s had a lot of very strong personalities. Beckenbauer was very much a leader, but you've also got the likes of Paul Breitner, very opinionated. Gunter Netzer, a bit more of a wild card. The strong Bayern Munich faction, and therefore also the strong not Bayern Munich faction to throw into the mix, makes it all. Well, I guess you always have this in these situations of a squad at a World Cup. You're going to have strong characters. You're going to have the elite players. But, I think he clearly helped unify them. But if we get into the specifics of the tournament a little bit, obviously we all know that the main perspective in terms of narrative of this tournament, aside from what comes at the end with the Dutch, was the East and West Germany clash. They were drawn together in the group. The opening round group, West Germany, they'd already beaten Chile and Australia without too much hassle in their opening games. And then East Germany were next up for them in Hamburg. Now, given Helmut Schon was from the East, although since he left in 1950, I guess he'd only spent a couple of years as an East German citizen. But was he possibly I don't know what the prevailing views would have been in West Germany in these days of someone who has defected. I wonder how they were viewed, of whether there was any issues around that when it came to having to face East Germany, of whether that cropped up again and again. And I think we'll talk a little bit in a sec about the aftermath of that game and the impact it had on him, because it was hugely significant, I think. But in advance of it, how much pressure was he possibly feeling then? And were any West German perspectives looking at the fact that he was from the East?
I think his success and the fact that he did defect and kind of escaped to come over to West Germany kind of said a lot about where he was. So the fact that he had come over was on his side, but certainly for him personally, there was a lot of significance. So regardless if there were any kind of external pressure, it's unmistakable that you had to leave your home because of the difficult political rule. You've got over there, and the sort of significance would have been quite big. There's sort of like that reunion would have been quite important to him. And I think, there's been talk before about, did West Germany throw that game to get an easier draw in the next group stage? Well, I think if you look at Schon's reaction, as you touched on, it would suggest that really isn't true. Or certainly not that the manager was doing. And that kind of altogether just shows that sort of that impact on him and how much pressure he was putting on himself. Because I think anybody, by today's standards, we talk about mental health and those sort of things around him. I'm sure he wasn't getting any of that support. And I think we know that, these things would, as a human, would have a massive impact on him, rather than kind of like people giving him stick. But he would always be aware of that, and people would ask that question. So it took on extra significance for him playing them.
No, absolutely. I mean, he's come into this with a huge amount of international experience. This is his third World Cup by this point, isn't it? So he's reached the final in 1966. He reached the semi-finals in 1970. He's won the Euros. And here we are with a home World Cup. And yeah, there's additional pressures of that. But I guess someone of that level of experience is well placed to handle it. But yeah, this East German factor was definitely a spanner in the works in a whole host of ways for West Germany and their progress in the tournament. It's obviously famous and well known that the East Germany won that game 1-0 thanks to a goal from Jürgen Sparwasser, who I think himself defected a few years before East Germany disappeared in the 1980s. The fallout from this, though, I think is really quite something. Now, obviously, following the defeat, in sporting terms, there was a strong backlash in the West German press. They had been anticipating victory, as you probably would have expected. Comments labeling the East German team, for example, as playing a pale, hackneyed football of the collective. A cliche alert there when it comes to the communists, but without the inspiration of great personalities. This is the West German press in advance of the game, whilst looking at the great personalities that they had in their own team. We've got Beckenbauer, Meyer, Breitner, etc. that we talked about. Afterwards, of course, the newspapers and the television media had an absolute field day, and Schon was crestfallen. I mean, his initial response to it seems to have, we can't go as far as saying he had a breakdown, but it seems like it deeply, deeply impacted him, especially in the short term. Seen reports that he was unable to properly communicate with his players in the aftermath. He cancelled press conferences, or a press conference for the day after the game, and he isolated himself a little bit. Now, things could have really gone awry, I guess, at this point. But you talked earlier about how he created the space for others to come to the fore or to influence and lead. Beckenbauer in this time obviously does come increasingly to the fore. Not that he wasn't prominent already. He was the captain. He was the key player, of course. But it's as though he almost, you don't want to say took over, but in terms of the public face of it, for a little time, I think he probably did. Is that fair, or is that a wrong reading of things?
No, I think so. I mean, I spoke to Rainer Bonhoff for the How to Win the World Cup, and he spoke about it really was there was no exaggeration that this was a huge thing for Schon, and he went in on himself and wasn't seen. And I mean, there's even stories that this wasn't Bonhoff that told me this, that his staff, Schon's staff, had to cut up his food because he'd gone that far back into him. And I think because of that sort of, it's almost like as a result of his management. So if he'd been that sort of dictator style manager and everything he said went, then the players wouldn't have been empowered to deal with this themselves. And Beckenbauer, as a captain, did step up. And obviously, we know in the future went on to be a successful manager himself of the national team. But I think that the way that Schon worked, it did give those players that sort of agency and the ability to take things on. And I think if he'd not been that sort of manager, it would have all fallen on its face. So I think he was supported around him, and exactly towards the end of the tournament how much influence Beckenbauer had over winning the entire thing. But certainly he was highly influential in kind of picking up the pieces after that group stage exit. And I think this is where, when you hear those stories, this is like to what I was saying, like it's not, you'd not have that sort of reaction and have to go to these lengths if they've kind of thrown that game to get an easier result. So I would suggest that that's not, as much as it makes a nice story, I don't think that rings 100% true at all.
No, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, that when you see the aftermath and the impact on him, that is a ludicrous thought, really, isn't it? It's one for the conspiracy theorists, I guess. But yeah, I mean, the DFB equally, you talked about how withdrawn he was. So the Deutsche Fußballbund, the FA, even apparently contemplated getting Schön's assistant Jupp Derval to take over or at least share the role a little bit more for the rest of the competition. And then Beckenbauer obviously stepped up in terms of press conferences and the public side of things. The calm focus of Beckenbauer is interesting when you talk about this time and how much of a role he had. He had a very calm demeanor and, well, always has in terms of his playing style, but also his public speaking. And it's interesting to wonder. I mean, obviously he became an extremely successful manager in his own right for West Germany, of how much of an influence Schon had over him. You kind of think when he took over at that time, very calm, very measured, very focused, at a time of crisis, in effect. Those experiences must have stood Beckenbauer in good stead, almost as you say, this is because of the conditions. It's not because of the crisis situation as such. It's the conditions that have been there for many years, 8 years or more by this point, under Schön's leadership, with Beckenbauer a key part of it throughout. That must have really stood Beckenbauer in great stead going forward.
I think it did. I mean, the way that it was, and I think the German football culture helped with that. And I think Schon, obviously, he changed the way that they played, but there was then always this sort of, all the way through that German story. So you've got Herberger, who was around, he'd been around the German setup prior to the Second World War, and obviously was part of the Wehrmacht then, and came back and led them to glory in '54. But then you kind of have that passing of the baton on, and then you eventually have Schon, who worked under him. You have Derval, who takes it. Beckenbauer as the next manager. You pass on, Bertie Vogts was there mid-90s, Rudi Völler, and it goes all the way through these decades. And I think there was that sort of idea that it was a succession planning, and eventually that was, what was an issue for Germany, and they had to change everything they'd done. But I think Beckenbauer, his way of managing, I've been speaking to Pierre Littbarski as well for the book, and Littbarski told me that you kind of think that Beckenbauer would be the sort of, they're barking these, impassioned team talks prior to kind of the World Cup finals. But what he did, he put the players' names on the board, and there was no sort of tactical work around them. And that was that. And he let the players kind of figure out themselves. And I think that's probably the influence, because it had worked so well under Schon that then it came through. But if you've got a particularly gifted group, as they were in the 70s, that probably works a little bit better until you get to that time where the quality might not be there. And of course, there's lots of different things kind of go into that, into kind of how the German system is bringing in players. But it wasn't then until Jogi Löw, again, actually as an assistant, and then took over as manager from Klinsmann, where that changed. And I know there was a lot of talk even then, I think, that Philipp Lahm talked about Klinsmann not doing much coaching. And I think he wasn't particularly complimentary about his style. And I think that became, because there was this success, and you see this with a lot of countries, that once there is that success, that is the way that they continue to do things. And I think Schon coming in after Herberger and doing as well as he did, and having the players working and doing that, probably inadvertently reaffirmed that this is the way that German football is successful. But it was just, these gifted players thinking for themselves was brilliant in that era. But as those things changed, it became out. So this is where you kind of see that influence, whether it was kind of a more of the soft skills, the personal management skills, rather than kind of like tactically maybe had those big impacts.
Moving on from that East Germany game, obviously that took West Germany into what was then a second round group stage at the World Cup. So they were up against Yugoslavia and Sweden, who they both dispatched, and then onto a final game with Poland, both teams having won all their games up to this point. This was the Poland who knocked England out, of course, famously at Wembley. Clown goalkeeper and all. We know the truth about all of that now. This is an excellent Polish team. Now, coming into this game, though, this was one where, again, the pressure was on. This was effectively a World Cup semi-final in all but name at this point. And the heavens open. And we're in a situation now where they were desperate to get the game on. All these side issues going on. But essentially, West Germany were up against, and this has echoes for what's coming up in the final, a very technically, I'm not going to say superior, but a technically excellent team that were riding their own crest of a wave, were, in many people's eyes, at least the equal of West Germany, maybe even in some cases in advance of them. Possibly more aesthetically pleasing in some people's eyes as well. The pressure again, so we've already lost to East Germany. We've already had that nightmare scenario come true. All of the pressure and the issues that come around that. Now we have a recovery, and we're running straight into a semi-final in effect, an all-or-nothing game against an excellent, excellent team in horrible conditions where things could have gone really, really wrong. The pressure again must have been immense.
Yeah, I mean, there's the political weight of that as well. I mean, West Germany couldn't avoid those sort of games, could they? Obviously, Poland being quite significant from that side, and then obviously, the final two in terms of the rivalries. But I think this is where, we talk about those influences of what Schon had, and I guess there was that sort of nice way of playing that he took from that Hogan DNA, if you like. But in moments like this is where the German DNA was strong, and that sort of belief, the real sort of confidence that they had, the resilience, and that was kind of the old school that they had that battle, they had that grit, the endeavour to kind of get over the line. I think that combination was what was so potent during this era, because some countries had, say, the technical ability, but they perhaps didn't have that same mentality that the West German side had. I think it was the combination of those things and the combination of Schon's influences and the West German influences that probably made them so formidable.
Well, absolutely. And they did get through that one. A 1-0 victory thanks to Gerd Muller goal. Well, not for the first or last time. Gerd Muller coming to their rescue. Speaking of which, the World Cup final, 1974. So we're off to Munich, the Olympic Stadium, in July 1974. Hordes of Dutch fans coming across now, the Sea of Orange in amongst the West Germany fans also. And again, you've got a situation where you've got the home nation with all the pressure, but then you've got the real charismatic, romantic story, if you like, of the Dutch that has captured many people's imaginations by this stage. I don't know whether one side was particularly favoured in advance of it or not in terms of general perception of who was likely to win. But when the Dutch took the lead before West Germany had even touched the ball, the pressure again is ramped up. And this is, we've talked already a few times about the calmness, the relying on the players or allowing the players to work things out during the games, in advance of the games, to reset themselves. And I guess this, if any game exemplified it perfectly, it was this one, when they were in danger of being initially blown away or of confidence taking a huge knock. We can talk obviously about how the Dutch actually approach things having taken the lead. That's a whole other issue really. But the West Germans could have fallen by the wayside quite easily after going down to such an early goal, in the manner of it too. I think the real key that they never even touched the ball until Meyer was picking it out of the back of his own net. It's astonishing really to then, by half time, be in the lead.
West Germany were less romantic, but they weren't, I think history, the story now and the narrative is that the Dutch side was, streets ahead of West Germany. Now, technically, clearly, they were ahead in some way, but not in the sort of gulf that we get told now. And, for all the Dutch, you've got the Dutch that were kind of like, there was the pressing and the rotational, that sort of positional freedom and that intelligence. But West Germany also had that intelligence. They were, it might have been they were perhaps not in the same stylistic way, but they had perhaps that little bit more substance. And you do see that with great teams in the past. I mean, look, you're a Newcastle fan, right? And you in the 90s, that side were so buccaneering, but they forgot that last little bit. And that's almost the difference that was there. It's that in those big moments, you need to have that extra sort of steel. And I think West Germany just had that. And, and it might be just in those, maybe it's not even a tactical thing, but they have that sort of ruthless nature. You've got a Beckenbauer who steps up. You've got Muller who, in the penalty box, anything's around there, he's going to score. And it might be just those little ingredients. And I think this is, international football in a nutshell, right? That the smallest things can change. And I think, especially when it's knockout football, they could play that game 10 times and Netherlands might have won 7 out of 10. But in that time, on that day, it was West Germany who did it because of those ingredients. And it's really difficult to compare and say, romantically, you want to say the Dutch were better. But, we always, romantically, you look at the style, you look at the technique, but football is about more than that. And that sort of kind of ability to bounce back and not think after the first few minutes and think, Christ, we're in for one here. That ability, that really says an awful lot about players and people, because it's that adversity that you need to find a way around.
Well, absolutely. And didn't they just manage that? I mean, Paul Breitner equalising with a penalty, fortuitous penalty perhaps. And then Gerd Muller, as ever, as you said in the penalty box, he was utterly lethal. I like the little contrast between the very fated turn that Cruyff made in an earlier match against Sweden, beautiful phase of play. But if you spin that bit of action on a little bit, he overhits the cross and absolutely nothing happens. A beautiful moment, well remembered, but led to nothing tangible. There's the Dutch. Whereas Muller, this is the difference, absolutely. Gerd Muller, he turns on a sixpence in the penalty area for his opportunity here right at the end of the first half and buries it and wins the World Cup. And I think 2 excellent turns, one more aesthetically pleasing than the other, but one far more effective and producing tangible reward than the other. And I think that I guess was the key difference between West Germany and the Dutch. But Helmut Schon obviously was the man who got them there, who allowed it all to happen, who enabled it, who did influence it, even if he had a little rocky time during the World Cup tournament, I think it's fair to say. He did remain as manager as well to 1978. And like we mentioned before of Del Bosque briefly in terms of Spain and how things carry on after you almost feel sometimes when you've hit the summit, maybe that's the time to stop. And I wonder if, given his time again, Helmut Schon would think that would have been the better way. Not that West Germany fell off a cliff or anything. Of course, they probably should have won Euro 76 2 years later, lost on penalties. And did okay at the 1978 World Cup, but a little bit of a shadow of what they had been before. By their lofty standards, I suppose the 78 World Cup was not such a great success. They lost to Austria, probably being the worst moment. Not as bad as the East Germany moment, but still. But I do wonder whether perhaps he should have ended things at the real peak, and maybe that would have cemented a stronger legacy.
Arguably, that's the same for the vast majority of managers, international managers. That, as we spoke about in the previous podcast on here, like the only manager to retain his title was Vittorio Pozzo under, potentially questionable circumstances. No other manager, once they've won a World Cup, have gone on to do it again. And obviously, there's lots of different factors in there, and 4 years between a tournament has an impact. But there is a point that once you've kind of achieved that, once you've climbed Everest, it takes a big man to be able to kind of step away. But that's true for everyone. And Jogi Löw was a really good example of that. as well, that he probably should have stopped when he won with Germany, but he didn't. He went on, and kind of you end up you go with not quite the same, glory as you would have done. And yeah, Schon is a prime example of that, but he's certainly not the only one. It's very difficult, especially because he'd been in place for so long. Was he going to, after a decade and winning the World Cup, was he going to stop there? It would have been very difficult. You look back and you say, oh, well, he should have done that now. But can you imagine walking away? You've just won the Euros, you just won the World Cup. You're thinking, great, well, I'm going to keep doing this. But yeah, I think that's something that everybody, every manager who's probably stayed on after winning would probably look back and say, I wish I'd stopped then.
Very true indeed. I mean, what he did do, of course, though, is win that 74 World Cup. And it's an intriguing thought of what that victory meant for West Germany as a country. It's well talked about what the 1954 victory did for West Germany as a country, almost like its rebirth, its coming out of the shadows of the war, allowing them to give some means of celebration. And if we leap ahead to 2006, okay, that wasn't a World Cup victory for Germany, but that again felt like a whole a moment of awakening, or another rebirth for Germany as a confident nation that felt okay to celebrate its own nation, which, for obvious reasons, was an awkward thing to do. Given this World Cup was a Cold War World Cup, we've had the issues. We have East Germany, we've had Poland that we talked about. What do you think the 1974 victory meant for West Germany as a nation, and Schon's role within that as somebody who spanned both sides?
I think it takes an extra significance because they hosted it, and I think, one thing we haven't spoken about is kind of the backdrop of what had gone on, and the Munich massacre at the Olympics 2 years earlier, and I think they'd all kind of lived, particularly there were credible threats against particularly the West German side, and all the teams were very aware of that. And I think actually, again, this is one thing that Schon managed brilliantly, was the high security situation they were in. It was so difficult to keep players motivated and feeling settled during a situation like that. So I think it was really important for them, not just with the success, but to show that they could host an event like that, and especially with what had happened before. I think this was kind of like they're really coming out into the world, and it's very difficult to kind of get into that psyche not being there. But I think that's certainly and not being German, but I think that was a big part of it for them. And then to win as well was kind of the icing on the cake. So I think it was a real sort of statement. And 54, because I think as well, because it carried that sort of miracle of Bern tag, there was always this sort of feeling of, yeah, they won, but they weren't the best team. And there was kind of a story around it and a question. And this was kind of them doing it. They kind of ended up playing another side who kind of like one of the non-winners who are romantically remembered as the best team at that tournament. But I think to do it again was a big statement for them. And I think for Schon is kind of repaying that as well. And I say like his role, when you kind of look at it as being, East Germany, Saarland, West Germany, and his role as a person, this was another part of that. It was another chapter, and I think it was an important chapter for him and the country as a whole.
Well, you said the phrase there about 1954, which, yes, as you rightly say, equally applies in many people's view to 74, that West Germany won but weren't the best team. I wonder how much, or whether he did resent that, looking back on it, whether the perception outside of Germany of the fact that the wrong team won, how much that would have grated on him.
I mean, it's difficult to say, isn't it? Because I think that there's always this conversation, but World Cups are a little bit different, because sometimes, particularly when it comes to like league titles, I mean, look where we are now. Arsenal won a league title in 2026, and people saying, oh, but they didn't play the way that they should. But that kind of in 20 years' time, people will just remember that Arsenal won it. A World Cup is a little bit different. So I suppose a lot of that comes over time, and looking back, and people still talking about the Dutch, talking about Netherlands, talking about Cruyff. But at the time, a win's a win, and that's the way you've got to be, quite ruthless about that. And I suppose it would be a lot more difficult to take if people weren't recognising the success you'd had and losing to a final than it is when you've kind of got that medal around your neck.
Very true indeed. And we mentioned Beckenbauer a little bit before as well. Obviously, he's the key character of the Helmut Schon era throughout and went on to win World Cups himself. But in between, we had an era where West Germany became loathed almost before Beckenbauer dragged them up again. So we had the 1982 World Cup, obviously, where everybody hated West Germany. Let's be honest. The stitch up of Algeria along the fixed game with Austria, allegedly fixed, I'll throw in there, and then the issues against France and Patrick Battiston in the semi-final, Harold Schumacher and so on. They became the team everyone wanted to hate. Now, if you throw in the fact that they've twice won the World Cup against everybody else's darlings, we've got then these nefarious approaches to things, the ruthlessness, if you like. It's just purely about the winning. Nothing else seems to matter. It was a little bit in contrast then to what had gone before from Helmut Schon's era, and then what would come after with Franz Beckenbauer's era. It's an odd little interlude, I guess, between the two. Now, this was Jupp Derval in charge during these times, who was Helmut Schon's assistant. As you said, that path that had led all the way through from Sepp Herberger through to those much, much later on. It's just interesting to me, I guess, that at that time, whilst probably not in and of themselves doing anything massively different, they still had talented players. They still could play very, very well and were very strong. And yet their general perception fell off a cliff.
I think it's funny, Pierre Lebarski again kind of talked about a German arrogance, if you like. I mean, he didn't mean that in a sort of a negative way. In the way he talked about it, he was like, it was this confidence that whoever they played, if it was a rival, they were always going to win. It didn't matter who they were going to play. And if they were in a penalty shootout, it didn't matter, they were going to win. And it was that sort of indelible confidence that was there. And I think particularly in this country, we don't like that. That's not a very British thing, is it? We don't like when people are kind of too confident, and that probably rubbed people up the wrong way. But I think as well, because everyone loves to hate a successful team, and they were a successful team. I know they didn't always get over the line and win World Cups at that time until Beckenbauer came in, but they were always there or thereabouts, and they knocked so many countries out. And that style, you trace it all the way back, and that style back to that sort of German ethos of, we are Germany, we've got this sort of resilience, and we work hard and we achieve this. And I think that was part of it as well. But, any team that wins, and with the political backdrop that it was at the time and within living memory, people were going to dislike West Germany, weren't they? I think that, I think they could have had the best team out there, and I think they probably would have, that historical baggage still would have been there at that time. And I think we look on it now, but I think it's just because we're a different generation and we kind of understand a little bit more, and a lot of people still kind of lived that, didn't they?
No, you're absolutely right. Absolutely right. Well, to round things off then, looking at Helmut Schon again, his legacy, how he's viewed historically. I mean, how history does view him, to my mind, and this may sound harsh, he does feel like a little bit of an afterthought when you come to the conversation of great coaches and managers. He's not one that leaps to mind, which, given everything we've talked about of how successful he was, that string of World Cup and European Championship performances, getting to the latter stages, winning 2 competitions, that should see him rated really highly, as the numbers suggest is true. And yet, and maybe there's echoes of that with Didier Deschamps today. He's someone who's reached the World Cup final twice, come within a kick or two of winning it twice, and may, again, this summer, may win it again. But would we ever include him in a conversation of great managers? I highly doubt it. I know times are different, and international management is probably less of the pinnacle than it was back then. But still, I don't get the feeling, and certainly this is my perception, that if I was to think of great managers through the 60s and 70s, Helmut Schon probably wouldn't leap to mind.
No, and I think that's fair. I mean, I do think some of it is because of what we remember, and it is that, bear in mind, he won the 74 World Cup, but then before it, you've kind of got, Brazil that greatest team ever won in 1970, and you've got then the Netherlands that were around in 74 and 78, and you kind of remember those times during. And so the 70s are dominated by, the start and the end and the middle are dominated by those two teams, and I think that probably is part of it, despite the fact that West Germany won. I think, we do remember, and Cruyff always spoke about this, is the winner the one who everyone remembers, and that sort of style, and that's very, very true. I think what makes a successful manager, particularly internationally, I don't think they are big names, and I think that also comes into it. There are exceptions to the rule, but it's actually normally the ones who are perhaps a little bit more nondescript and haven't done something in the club game that are there, and that's why they don't end up being in that conversation. I mean, you look at the variety of the ones who've won in more recent World Cups. Lionel Scaloni, Argentina didn't really want him beforehand. He'd been an interim manager and other options hadn't worked out, and he came in and people thought he was too conservative, won a World Cup. Deschamps is criticised in his own country for keeping the handbrake on. Like you say, won a World Cup, got to a Euros final, got to another World Cup final and lost on penalties. So pragmatism is a big part of it. And I think because you look at it and you're like, it's not stylistically beautiful, which Schon, aside from his name being beautiful in German, there's not a lot else there because he was overshadowed, and he was an innovator, but he wasn't as much of an innovator as the Netherlands. So I think that's ultimately what counts against him. It's just that there was almost kind of a bit of one-upmanship going on somewhere else. Therefore, you don't recognise his impact and what he did at the time and how he was different because someone had done something a little bit stylistically better. And that kind of puts you, as we remember in history, everyone remembers Michels and Cruyff, but perhaps not Schon.
This is true, and yet Schon was the one who won. So yeah, hopefully this has gone a little way to redressing that balance and adding a bit more to the story of Helmut Schon and his stint as West Germany and indeed Saarland national coach, which brought huge success over an incredible length of time. For West Germany. Well, thank you very much, Chris. It's been another fascinating chat. Another shout out to your book that we need to mention, of course, How to Win the World Cup, the updated edition, which is very much out there for everybody to buy. I would urge everyone to go and do that. It's an excellent read. But yes, thank you very much for your contributions tonight, Chris.
Thanks, everyone.
Spot on, and we will be back with more podcasts here at Your Boys Took a Hell of a Beating, so do be sure to give us a like, share, follow, all of that stuff, and join us again next time. Thank you very much, and goodbye.